to me, Nick Land's contribution is opening the intellect up to discontinuities at the level of time. Not many theorists have thought about time as deeply and as profoundly and as scarily, if you want, as British, I don't know what I would call him, philosopher, theorist, Nick Land. For Nick Land, as for almost everyone else in the sphere of phenomenology, time was the question. Heidegger, for example, arrived at the conclusion that basically we are time. Time is the unfolding of the Dasein, for example. And since then, the question of time had been very pertinent to all those trying to respond to Heidegger or fulfill his project. Not the least of which including Gilles Deleuze. But more deeply, if we go into the past, you have these currents in Western thinking that could probably be considered counter-philosophical or maybe anti-philosophical. Kant, with his notion of the synthetic a priori and his transcendental structure of reality, also managed to do something unprecedented in the history of human thinking, and that is kind of capture all of being and rein it in and cage it into this prison, right? This dreary prison of monochronological, monostructural, and monolithic experience. That was Kant's basic achievement. Kant basically set out to prove a universal basis for our shared experience, and that's what he accomplished with his philosophical project. But then you have thinkers like Nietzsche who are trying to subvert this lofty endeavor of German idealism. People like Nietzsche, for example, who are famous for these notions like the eternal return, that nothing actually changes at all. The experience of change is a narrow perspective in regards to the real return of just the same old thing. Nothing ever changes. But the way in which nothing ever changes appears to be different to us. And tragically, it's not. Every time we think something new occurs, it's just the return of the same old thing. That's the Nietzschean perspective. The moment in which we experience the most possible novelty is the moment in which we experience a return of the same. And what makes that so, Nick Land's words, what makes that a black comedy, what makes it so tragical, is that it's not as if we can just say, oh, nothing changes, so this is how reality is, I'm comfortable with the way reality is, I'm fine with the way reality is, and I've accepted it and come into terms with it. You can't do that, right? Because reality only asserts being only asserts what it has always been in the very experience of change. That's what makes it so tragicomical. It's like a sick joke, right? Because think about it, right? Imagine if we experience nothing changing. And then we say, okay, this is all reality's ever going to amount to be. Nothing changes, this is it. No, this is not it. Yeah, you're going to experience a change, and precisely at that moment, you're going to experience the return of just the same old thing. There's no escape from the tragedy of eternal recurrence. No escape at all. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to cope with it. There's no way to dilute its disappointment for us. Well, more or less, along comes Nick Land. For Nick Land, I'm not going to really summarize everything, but I'm just going to explain it in these terms. Nick Land is a guy who likes to think about time. Let's just put it that way, right? He's someone with a fixation and a focus specifically on time, coming from the post-structuralist perspective. But Land hated the academy. He hated academia. He thought there was something false and hypocritical about the sterility and the self-conceited and self-satisfied, smug, pretentiousness of these post-structural academics who didn't really try to actually arrive at the fullest conclusions who didn't take their conclusions to their fullest practical consequences. They just kind of dwelled in this place of, self-satisfied contentness, always writing out more fucking books and novels and journals, trying to critique reality in terms of, this is the truth behind things. He hated this fucking university academic system, basically, right? And Nick Land extended that hatred very far. As a Deleuzian who considered the conceptual apparatus, if you want to call it that, of Gilles Deleuze and the philosophy of Deleuze to be ultimate tool and weapon against this disgusting culture of the academy. Well, Deleuze was someone who basically, he wrote the book Anti-Oedipus, and that's basically what Deleuze is all about. For Deleuze, he wants to go beyond the Freudian Oedipal relations of patriarchy, and it's kind of like, it almost seems like it's paganism, right? Deleuze wants to unleash the fullest powers of the rhizomatic, decentralized nature of being, difference, pure difference, over and against the ways in which it's domesticated by these monolithic structures, which straitjacket being into just being one thing. More or less, that's kind of the gist of it, right? Well, Land, he's called kind of like a mad black magician Deleuzian. So Deleuze is still like a smiling, optimistic, leftist kind of guy. And Nick Land, he assumes that perspective, but in a really dark and nihilistic way. Because for Nick Land, the purport of any shared experience or shared reality or monolithic chronology, any monolithic meaning even of reality was just a cope. Reality proper is chaos proper. There's no consistency to it and there's no meaning to it. Meaning is purely derivative. There's no meaning in the real. It's just this decentralized flux of pure discontinuities, numbers more specifically. All of the lofty and grandiose concepts which we invest meaning in are only should be, to quote something like, lined up for savage decoding into their constituent, pure quantitative parts. So Nick Land, he does something that is extremely unique and seemingly paradoxical from the perspective of any kind of, for example, traditional critique of modernity. René Guénon described modernity as the reign of quantity. For René Guénon, modernity refers to the way in which reality is being subsumed by this kind of quantization, this mathematization of reality. But Nick Land opens up the opposite perspective. Nick Land says, no, the wild, archaic, pre-modern, if you will, reality is this savage reality of code, this underlying purely decentralized, completely emptied and devoid of all meaning, relations between numbers, these quantities. Quantities are savage, wild, and free, whereas human meaning, the sacred, if you will, is contrived and artificial. So he's basically completely inverting the Guinanian perspective that is typically associated with the critique of modernity. Numbers are wild and savage, right? Nick Land, he describes it like cosmic. I'm not sure, but it's precisely sacral meaning, as Guinan would put it, which is like artificially contrived and needs to be protected with this abstract security system that protects some kind of center against the underworld of reality. In any case, with this view by Land comes an understanding, or a view also, of linear and irreversible time being this kind of form of gaslighting, if you want. For Land, I have to explain the hyperstition stuff as well, but okay, I'm gonna explain the thing first, and then explain what a hyperstition is and why it would be a hyperstition. So, thank you, Jackson, for the raid, but also fuck you for dishing the MAGA stuff. Anyway. For Nick Land, he tries, and he uses this as a conceptual device, to make us think about a conspiracy. And the conspiracy is called the architectonic order of the eschaton. Okay? And the architectonic order of the eschaton is this all-pervasive and all-encompassing conspiracy which assimilates the wild and savage forces of change, basically, of temporal change, into a monolithic and shared experience of reality. And that's why it's a conspiracy, by the way, because it has to be like this octopus with tentacles, or probably Deleuze would describe it as a tree, which is another symbol of tyranny for Deleuze, which basically has to assail and domesticate these wild flux and forces going in all possible directions into one shared experience of reality. And for Land, that's called the architectonic order of the eschaton. And you could see why he calls it that, because it's like an architecture. They're creating this architecture of an eschaton. An eschaton basically gives one conclusion to reality. Eschatology is about the end of times. So if eschatology is therefore also about the ends of time, like what conclusion is time going in the direction of fulfilling? And if there's one eschaton, all forces of temporal change, flux, basically go in that direction. Now, I have to keep in mind, Nick Land has never understood Hegel. He's not a Hegelian. Also, Nick Dugan is not a Hegelian either. Hegel is something I have to filter these people through. Because at the end of the day, I'm exploring these thinkers from a distance. I'm a Marxist-Leninist, super Hegelian. And I'm exploring these thinkers, right? So I can perceive their mistakes and their shortcomings while also understanding their perspective. But because of that, Nick Land has always remained within this very binary Kantian perspective, according to which, yeah, I'm just kind of butchering it, but according to which you have reality on the one hand, the real thing, the real reality, right? Real reality. And then the shared human experience of reality. So it's the same thing. The architectonic order of the eschaton for Land is a conspiracy in which the real becomes domesticated by this shared human experience in the form of the modern universal state. The modern universal state. But Land is saying this is the conspiracy in the absence of which there would be no shared experience of reality. Reality would invade us from all sorts of alien forces, would invade us from all possible perspectives. And, we could not domesticate them within any frame of meaning. The time would, rather than be linear and irreversible, disperse into this kind of flat plane of immanence. It would be aeonic time, eternal time, time that always was, always will be, eternity proper, if you will. Chaos is another way of referring to that. Or at least you can call it chaotic. Yeah, it is kind of Hobbesian in a way. Kind of, it is in a way. But because Land is a revolutionary, especially at this moment in his life, Land wants to blow up the structure of common human experience in general. And by the way, when I say human experience, understand that Land does not understand human beyond institution. He hates the institution, and this hatred of institutions extends to a type of misanthropy for Land, a hatred of humanity. Land identifies man in general, the abstraction that is humanity, with the universal man of Western modernity. So it's an institutional subject. Land's view is like, okay, in the absence of the French universal man, what humanity exists? It's just like, a bunch of different people and a different, lines of genetic code. There's no shared human species. So that's also Land's anti-humanism. That's where he's coming from with his anti-humanism. Keep in mind, I think this is a very short-sighted perspective. And I could probably explain why in another stream, but I just want to introduce you to Nick Land. Because this is a very scary guy. Very scary guy, the conclusions he arrives at are very scary and spooky to think about. We are nearing Halloween, and it's a spooky time, right? It's fun. So yeah, he's kind of a dark Hobbes. Well, he's British. He's coming from that perspective. That behind everything, right? Behind everything that we invest in meaning, behind all of this is just some very cold, impersonal, and alien force driving reality. By the way, Nick Land is known as being an accelerationist. So what is accelerationism, given that perspective, right? All accelerationism basically means is, I guess, that things, basically, we have this architectonic order of the eschaton, right? But capitalism is moving too fast for the conspiracy to assimilate. It's just moving too fast. Before you could even think to assail it within a common frame of meaning, things are moving and succeeding and changing in ways that cannot be domesticated. So accelerationism is basically a current of thought that tries to, ironically, make sense of that fact. It's not a normative project. It's not a practical project where people want to do things. It's not about doing anything. It's about coming to terms with something that is happening or supposedly happening. An acceleration in reality that is overloading the system. The system by which we establish a shared experience of being.
Good
So,
morning, revolution.
thank you, Muriel. Appreciate that. So, without delving too much farther into the history of Landian thought, because it goes pretty far, and it stumbles upon very insurmountable limitations. Am I a Landian? If I am, I'm not only a Landian because it's not enough. It clearly reaches a ceiling of some kind. So Land, he seems like the total opposite of Dugan, basically, right? But there's similarities purely at the level of they seem like they're partisans. Land seems like a guerrilla partisan at the level of time, and Dugan seems like a guerrilla partisan at the level of space. That probably sums up and explains their differences. Also, one is British and one is Russian. So what could be more different than that? I agree. If you want to start with Land, start with Dugan. I can endorse that. I can agree with that. Now, okay? So let me critique Land. Just a virtue signal to all the Hegelians that I'm not. You don't have to purge me. I'm not. I don't agree with Land. I don't agree with Land's narrow Kantian understanding of aeonic time, pure eternity, pure plane of immanence of chaos or whatever. The kind of rhizomatic whatever, versus the monochronological continuum of time. I think that is a very narrow and one-sided understanding of the discontinuities in time, basically. I think it's a false dichotomy, basically. It's basically the same critique of Deleuze you'll find in Zizek. I weaponize that against Land. Badiou and Zizek, they critique Deleuze, and I stand by that critique, also against Nick Land. So this contradiction between pure differences and pure multiplicity on one hand, if you will, right, and the one mono homogeneity on the other is false. And the reason it's false is because it does not include the homogeneity in the immanence of being itself. It doesn't include the split, I should rather say, in the immanence of being itself. If it included the split, it would have to come to terms with the fact that reality is dialectical. It's the unity of opposites. There's an irreducible split and antagonism, or at least some kind of difference at the heart of being itself. So pure immanence is an impossibility because transcendence is a part of immanence. So it's what Hegel... It's just Hegel's critique of Kant, okay? It's nothing more. Hegel's critique of Kant and Spinoza. It's the same thing, okay? So, with that being said, to me, Nick Land's contribution is opening the intellect up to discontinuities at the level of time. Nick Land does for time what Dugan does for space. Even if I don't agree with Nick Land's view of the architectonic order of the eschaton, which, by the way, is a hyperstition. And what a hyperstition is that it's kind of like a fiction which is more true than fact. It's a kind of fiction that that captures or gives expression to virtual orientations in reality that facts are not capable of. So that's a hyperstition, basically. Also, another critique of Land I have is that I don't think the structure of time he describes, it's ironic to call it that, I think he critiques modern linear whatever time, but he doesn't oppose that to some kind of like wild flux of temporal succession. He counterposes it with a very clear, consistent kind of retrocausal, spiral-like model of temporality, which I think is also mono. Thank you so much, Darren. Appreciate that so much. Which is also
Speak
mono.
on the dialectical method.
Thank you, Darren. Which is also mono. Land also is a kind of monotheist, but he's a Muslim instead of a Anglican. Basically, Nick Land should have converted to Islam. He's looking for a god, but the Anglican god of modernity is not adequate, so he should adopt the Muslim one. But that's just my advice, right? Anyway, what does that have to do with the Ukraine war? Well, previously I described to you what China did. China punctured the fabric of the temporal plane of modernity as we know it. It hid its time and it's bid its strength, assailing modern temporal succession into a grander scheme that can be understood within the measurement of that same modern temporal succession. If China did that, that has some spatial consequences. Just like the arrival of dawn has spatial consequences for a grandfather clock. When dawn comes, what happens? Sorry, I could be getting this wrong too. The grandfather clock, not only does it move its hand, it rings, makes a sound, marking this event. That is what Russia has done in Ukraine. Russia realizes the spatial consequences of the Chinese time war that has been happening, that's been going on for decades. And Russia has simply received its calling. Russia has received the calling of what China has already done and decided to announce to the world that the reign of Anglo-Saxon modernity, which Nick Land will probably call the architectonic order of the eschaton, it's the same thing, is over. And we thought this whole time that there was a pure continuity because of our ignorance. But we didn't know that this whole time it quite literally overthrows. It overthrows and it breaks the prevailing order as we know it. But it's crucial that people understand so as to not possess some kind of narrow voluntaristic view that randomly Putin woke up on the wrong side of the bed one day and he just attacked Ukraine. And that's how this started. In reality, what's happened is that the work that gives meaning or at least gives ground to the special military operation, was happening all this time for decades before. Specifically in taking like economic form in the way in which the Chinese economy was overtaking the American one. All the work was happening underneath, as Marx described of the sound under Shakespeare's stage. And Russia is just the old mole who has popped up from the ground. And we think the mole came from nowhere, but the whole time that it was the noise tapping on the stage, below the stage. Well-burrowed old mole. That's the saying from Marx. And that's what we say to Russia. So that's my lecture on what Nick Land can teach us about the Ukraine war. The war is not just a territorial change, it's a change at the level of time itself. This is a very brief introduction to the ideas of Nick Land and accelerationism, and it's by no means comprehensive, and I'll spend another video or stream introducing that. What does off a beam mean? And is that relevant to me in any way? What does off a beam mean? What does that even mean?
Base.
Thank you, Trapsui.
What do you think of Yukhaway?
Oh, he's brilliant. I recommend him 1000%. I'm going to confess, I didn't read his whole book, and I want to read the whole thing. I didn't read the whole thing. But I really recommend him. The Question of Technology in China. I really recommend it. He's brilliant. But I didn't read the whole book, unfortunately. I do want to, though, and I do plan on it.